My name is Renee Castellan. I'm 33 years old, and I spent last Christmas Eve alone in my apartment, listening to my own mother plan how to steal from me while she thought the call had already ended. It started with a notification, nothing more. My mom had tried to video call me at 8:14 that night to wish me a happy holiday from 3 states away, the kind of call we'd been doing for the past 2 years, since I stopped being invited to the house in person. I was curled up on my couch in sweatpants, a glass of wine going warm on the side table, and I answered on the second ring because some small stupid part of me still hoped it would feel like family. The screen was dark for a second, then it caught, and I could see the edge of my parents' kitchen, the same yellow tile backsplash I grew up leaning against while my mother cooked. But nobody was looking at the phone. It was propped against the fruit bowl, angled just wrong, capturing the room instead of a face. I almost hung up right then. I figured she'd butt-dialed me, that I'd catch her a second later, laughing, saying, "Oh my gosh, sorry honey, let me find you." Instead, I heard my sister Paige's voice, bright and loose the way it gets after a second glass of champagne, and I heard her say a name that made my stomach drop before my brain even caught up to why. She said, "Once Renee signs off on the trust distribution in January, she'll never even know it's gone." I sat very still on my couch, the wine glass halfway to my mouth, my whole body gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the December draft coming through my window. My father's voice came next, low, the voice he uses when he thinks he's being careful. He said something about the accountant, about how the paperwork just needed one more signature from me, how I trusted the family enough that I'd sign whatever they put in front of me without reading it closely, the same way I always had. And my mother laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, more like the laugh you give when a plan is finally working, when the hard part is behind you and all that's left is the easy part, the part where nobody notices what happened until it's far too late to undo it. She said, "That's the beauty of it, she's not even here to ask questions." I want you to understand something about who I am, because it matters for everything that comes after. I'm a forensic accountant. I have spent 11 years of my professional life finding exactly this kind of thing, the small, quiet theft dressed up as a family favor, the signature obtained through trust rather than force, the distribution that looks clean on paper and isn't clean at all underneath. I have sat across the table from grown children who watched their parents drain a sibling's inheritance and called it fair because one child needed it more. I have built my entire career on being the person who catches that. And here I was, sitting alone on Christmas Eve in an apartment I paid for myself, listening to my own family talk about me, exactly the way I talk about the people in my case files. Except this time I wasn't the accountant working the file. I was the file. I didn't say anything. I didn't clear my throat or make a sound or do anything to let them know the call hadn't disconnected the way they assumed it had. I just sat there and listened, because some instinct older than my training, older than any spreadsheet I'd ever built, told me that the only advantage I had in that moment was that they thought I couldn't hear them. Paige's voice came again, softer this time, almost sweet, and she said, "I still feel a little bad, but honestly, it's not like she needed it the way I do. She's fine. She's always fine. That's just who Renee is. That's just who Renee is." I have heard some version of that sentence my entire life, and I used to think it was a compliment, back when I was young enough to believe that being called fine was the same thing as being loved. I sat with the phone in my lap, the screen still showing that crooked angle of the kitchen I grew up in, and I thought about how strange it is that the people who taught you to be strong are so often the first ones to use that strength against you, to decide that because you can survive without something, you shouldn't be given it in the first place. I finally set the phone down face up on the couch cushion beside me and let it keep recording, because by then, some cold, clear part of my brain, the part that gets paid to find exactly this kind of evidence for other people, had already started working. I let the call run for another 11 minutes. I know because I checked the timestamp later, 11 minutes of my family talking through the details of what they were about to do to me, while I sat 40 feet away in spirit and 3 states away in fact, perfectly quiet, perfectly patient, taking it all in the way you take in a diagnosis you already suspected but were too afraid to have confirmed. To understand how I ended up on that couch, listening to my own mother talk about signing away what was legally mine without me knowing, you have to go back 6 weeks, to the phone call at the beginning of November, the one where my mother asked me, so gently, so reasonably, to please just skip Christmas this year, so that your sister doesn't feel uncomfortable. I need to tell you about Millbrook, Connecticut, the town where I grew up, because you can't understand what happened at Christmas without understanding the 29 years that came before it. Millbrook is the kind of place where every house has a wraparound porch, and every family pretends their driveway isn't slightly too small for the number of cars parked in it. My father, Walter Castellan, ran a small insurance agency downtown for 31 years, the kind of business where everybody in town knew his name, and half of them owed him a favor. My mother, Diane, stayed home when we were young, and then worked the front desk at the pediatric office, 2 towns over, once Paige and I were both in school. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, and comfortable in a small town means everybody is watching how you raise your kids. There were 2 daughters in that house, but from the very beginning, there was only ever one who mattered in the way that counted. Paige is 4 years younger than me, and she came into the world doing what she has always done best, which is making people feel needed by her. She was born 6 weeks early, tiny and struggling, and my parents spent the first month of her life in a hospital waiting room, learning to be terrified for her. I think something in that terror never left them. Paige became, in their minds, the fragile one, the one who required extra care, extra patience, extra everything, and that framing calcified into the architecture of our entire childhood before either of us was old enough to understand what was happening. I don't say this with bitterness about her being born early. That was never her fault, and I want to be fair about that. What I'm bitter about, if I'm honest, is what came after, the way my parents built an entire family religion around the idea that Paige needed protecting, and I did not, as though needing had ever been a fixed quantity, instead of something every child deserves in equal measure. I got bruises playing outside and nobody worried I'd break. Paige got a scraped knee, and my mother would cancel her whole afternoon. I learned very young that the fastest way to get a moment of my mother's attention was to be sick, and even then, she'd ask if I was sure, in a tone that suggested my illness was somehow less believable than my sister's. I remember being 9 years old and winning the county spelling bee, the actual county, not just my school, standing on a stage in front of 200 people and spelling my way through words I'd studied for 3 months in secret, because I didn't want to jinx it by telling anyone. My parents came. I'll give them that. They sat in the 3rd row. But that same weekend, Paige had a dance recital, just a local studio thing, nothing regional or special, and when we got home that night, my mother spent the entire dinner talking about how beautiful Paige looked in her costume, how proud she was, how she cried during Paige's solo. Nobody asked me to spell anything at that table. My trophy sat in the back seat of the car for 3 days before anyone thought to bring it inside. By the time I was in middle school, I had stopped expecting the spotlight and started building something quieter instead, a kind of competence that didn't need an audience. I got straight A's without being asked. I babysat the neighbor kids for money starting at 12, because nobody was going to hand me an allowance the way they handed Paige hers. I learned to do my own laundry, pack my own lunches, handle my own permission slips, not because anyone taught me those things, but because I figured out early that if I didn't manage myself, nobody else was going to manage me for me. My mother used to say it with such pride at family gatherings. Our Renee, she's just so independent, so responsible, we never have to worry about her. She said it like a gift she was giving me. I understand now that it was actually the moment she stopped worrying about me at all. Paige, meanwhile, was given everything wrapped in that same worried tenderness that had started in a hospital room when she was 6 weeks old and simply never stopped. When she struggled in math in 7th grade, they hired a private tutor twice a week. When I struggled in chemistry 2 years later, my mother told me to try harder, that I was smart enough to figure it out on my own, that they couldn't afford tutoring for everything. I remember doing the math in my head even then. $80 a week for Paige's tutor, $0 for mine, and understanding with a clarity that felt like ice water that this wasn't about affordability at all. It was about who they believed was worth the investment. The pattern followed us into adulthood exactly the way you'd expect it to, because patterns like that don't dissolve just because you turn 18 and move out. I put myself through college on scholarships and loans and 3 part-time jobs, graduated with a degree in accounting, and built a career from the ground up, first at a mid-sized firm doing tax work I hated, then clawing my way into forensic accounting because I discovered I had a genuine talent for finding the places where numbers were lying. Nobody in my family ever asked how I did it. My mother's version of pride was always some variant of, well, you always were the responsible one, delivered with a kind of relief, as though my success meant she never had to think about me too hard. Paige, on the other hand, drifted through her 20s the way certain people are allowed to drift when someone is always there to catch them. She tried nursing school and dropped out in her second year. She tried a marketing job and lost it after 8 months. She started an online boutique that lasted a single holiday season and left my parents quietly absorbing $4,000 in unsold inventory they never mentioned to me until I found the credit card statement folded into a drawer during a visit home. Every failure came wrapped in the same soft language. Paige is finding herself. Paige is going through a hard time. Paige just needs a little more support right now. And every single time, that support came from the same well. My parents' savings, their patience, their unconditional forgiveness, resources that had never once, not a single time in my entire life, been extended to me with that same generosity. I want to be honest about something, because it's the part of this story people struggle to believe. I didn't resent her for it. Not really. Not for years. I told myself she needed it more than I did, the same lie my parents had been telling themselves and me since we were children. I told myself that being needed less was its own kind of privilege, that my independence was a strength, and not a wound they had carved into me one small neglect at a time. I believed that story for a very long time, right up until the November phone call that finally showed me what that independence had actually been building toward all along. A version of me they thought was so self-sufficient, so unnecessary to consider, that they could plan an entire theft around the fact that I would never even think to ask questions. By the time I turned 30, I had built the kind of life nobody in my family ever asked me a single question about. I made partner track at Halloway & Beck, a mid-sized forensic accounting firm out of Hartford, specializing in exactly the kind of work that would end up saving me later, tracing hidden assets, uncovering fraudulent transfers, reading the fine print in trust documents that most people sign without a second glance. I bought a 2-bedroom condo on my own at 28, with a down payment I'd saved dollar by dollar since college. I drove a paid-off Honda with 110,000 miles on it because I have never once in my life needed anyone to be impressed by what I drive. I built an emergency fund, a retirement account, a life that didn't depend on a single other person catching me if I fell, because I had spent my whole childhood learning that nobody was going to be standing there if I did. None of this made a dent in how my parents saw me. If anything, it hardened the story they'd already written. My mother would introduce me at holiday parties as our Renee, the accountant, so smart, so put together, and there was always a strange flatness underneath the pride. The same flatness you'd use to describe a well-maintained appliance. Nobody ever asked me what I was working on. Nobody asked if I was happy. The assumption, unspoken but absolute, was that because I could handle myself, I didn't need handling. And in a family that ran entirely on who needed what, being someone who needed nothing meant you had quietly written yourself out of the story without anyone noticing you'd done it. What almost nobody knew, not even Paige, was that 8 years earlier, my grandmother Eleanor, my mother's mother, had set up a family trust before she passed, and I was named as co-trustee alongside my mother. Grandma Eleanor had been the one person in that family who never once made me feel like an afterthought. She used to send me cards for no reason at all, just a folded $10 bill and a note that said, "Thinking of my clever girl," and when I got my CPA license, she took me to lunch at the nicest restaurant in Millbrook and told the waiter, unprompted, that her granddaughter was going to be somebody someday. She'd built up a modest but real estate over her lifetime, a rental property in town, some careful investments, savings that had compounded quietly for decades, and when she set up the trust, she specifically asked her lawyer to name me alongside my mother, not Paige, because in her words, recorded in the attorney's own file notes I would find much later, Renee is the one who understands money and the one who won't need to be protected from her own family. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. I signed the paperwork Grandma Eleanor's lawyer sent over. A formality, really. Co-trustee status that mostly meant I'd be consulted on major distributions and would need to countersign anything significant. I never asked for updates. I never checked the account balances. I trusted my mother, who was the primary trustee handling the day-to-day, to manage things fairly. Because that's what you do with family. You extend the same good faith you'd want extended to you. I had no idea that this trust, this quiet legacy my grandmother had built specifically to make sure I was never left out again, would become the exact thing my family decided to take from me the moment they thought I wasn't paying attention. The signs were there for years if I'd been looking for them, but I wasn't, because I had trained myself not to look, the same way you stop checking a wound once the scar tissue forms over it. There was the summer 2 years ago when my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that Paige had needed help with a car repair, and they'd covered it, and I noticed the amount seemed high for a car repair, close to $6,000, but I didn't push. There was the Thanksgiving before that, when I overheard my father on the phone with someone he called just about the property, his voice low and careful in the way people get when they're discussing something they don't want overheard. And I told myself it was probably about their own house, insurance renewal, something boring and unremarkable. Paige's life, meanwhile, had entered a new and more expensive phase of collapse. She'd rebranded herself as a life coach and wellness consultant, a career that, as far as I could tell, involved posting inspirational content online and charging clients for advice she'd never actually tested on herself. It required, according to her, a certain lifestyle to be credible, a nicer apartment, a car that photographed well, a wardrobe that suggested success even in the absence of it. My parents funded all of it, quietly, steadily, the same well they'd always drawn from, except now the well was running dangerously low because their own retirement savings had never been large to begin with, and Paige's needs had grown considerably more expensive than tutoring or a dance recital costume. I found out later, piecing it together from bank records and my own memory of half-heard conversations, that by that November, Paige owed roughly $31,000 across 2 credit cards and a personal loan she'd taken out to fund a coaching certification program that turned out to be, as far as I could tell, entirely unaccredited. My parents had already given her everything they could spare from their own accounts. There was nowhere left to draw from except the one place they still had access to that hadn't been touched, Grandma Eleanor's trust, the trust that legally required my signature as co-trustee before any significant distribution could be made, the trust that had been built specifically because my grandmother once looked at her family and decided that her clever girl was the one who deserved protecting from exactly this kind of thing. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly had to. The very safeguard my grandmother had built to protect me had become the obstacle standing between my parents and the money they wanted to give my sister. And instead of coming to me, instead of calling and saying, "Renee, we need to talk about the trust, we need your help," they did what this family had always done best. They found a quieter way around the person they'd spent 30 years training not to ask questions. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, while I was at my desk finishing a report on a client's misappropriated vendor payments, the kind of case that used to feel abstract to me, before I learned exactly how personal that word misappropriated could become. My mother's name lit up my phone screen, and I remember feeling a small flicker of pleasant surprise, because she didn't call often, usually just a text on my birthday or a group message about who was bringing what to Thanksgiving. I picked up expecting small talk. What I got instead was a voice that had clearly been rehearsed. "Renee, honey," she said, and there was a warmth in it that I should have recognized as performance, because my mother's real warmth had always been quieter than that, more distracted, the warmth of someone thinking about something else while she talked to you. This performed warmth was different, deliberate, the tone of someone who had practiced a difficult conversation in the mirror before making the call. She asked how work was going, whether I'd seen the cold snap coming in from the north, a small filler that I now understand was just her working up the nerve for what came next. Then she said, "So I wanted to talk to you about Christmas this year." I told her I was planning to drive up on the 23rd like always, that I'd already requested the time off, that I was thinking of bringing the cranberry walnut bread she always liked. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you the person on the other end is choosing their next words with a great deal of care. "Honey," she said finally, "I think it might be better if you sat this one out this year. Your sister is going through such a hard time right now, with everything, the business, her confidence, and I just think having everyone there, having you there, might make things feel more complicated than they need to be. She's been so fragile lately, and I don't want anything to upset that balance." I remember sitting very still at my desk, my pen hovering over the report I'd been working on, trying to process what I'd just heard. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what exactly about me being there would upset Paige. My mother's voice softened further, took on that careful, apologetic register she uses when she wants you to feel guilty for even asking the question. "It's not about you doing anything wrong, sweetheart. It's just, you know how you two are. You have such different energies, and Paige has been working so hard on herself, on not comparing herself to people, and I think this year, just this one year, it would help her to have the space. You understand, don't you? You're the strong one. You'll be fine either way." There it was again, that phrase, "you're the strong one," delivered like a gift, functioning like a door closing. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, and some old, well-trained part of me, the part that had spent 29 years absorbing exactly this kind of message, wanted to say, "Of course, Mom, whatever's easiest, don't worry about me." That part of me was already halfway to saying it before the rest of me, the part that spends her working life catching people in the exact kind of soft, reasonable-sounding lie my mother had just told me, caught up and asked a different question instead. I asked her what exactly Paige was struggling with, what having me there would specifically make harder. My mother hesitated, and in that hesitation, I heard something I couldn't name yet, but that made the hair on my arms stand up, a kind of scrambling, the sound of someone realizing they hadn't prepared for a follow-up question because they'd assumed I wouldn't ask one. She said something vague about Paige feeling insecure about her career, compared to mine, about not wanting the holiday to turn into a comparison contest, about wanting to give Paige a season where she could just feel supported, without feeling measured against her big sister's success. It sounded reasonable enough on the surface, the kind of explanation that would have satisfied me completely 2 years earlier. But I noticed something my mother didn't seem to notice she was revealing, which was that this entire conversation felt less like a request and more like a negotiation she'd already had with someone else before she ever picked up the phone to call me. The phrasing was too smooth, too rehearsed, the kind of language you use when you've talked something through with another person first and arrived at a version everyone agreed on. My mother has never in her life been a smooth talker on the phone. She stumbles over her words, backtracks, apologizes mid-sentence for things that don't need apologizing for. This call had none of that. This call sounded like something she and my father, and probably Paige, had workshopped at the kitchen table before she ever dialed my number. I told her I understood, that I'd stay home for Christmas this year, that I hoped Paige felt better soon. I kept my voice level and pleasant the entire time, the voice I use in client meetings when I already suspect fraud, but don't yet have the paperwork to prove it. My mother sounded relieved, genuinely relieved, in a way that told me the hardest part of whatever this was had just been cleared. She said she loved me, that we'd figure out a time to celebrate just the two of us, maybe in January, that this wasn't personal, and I said okay, and I meant it in the sense that I would let her believe I'd accepted it at face value, and I did not mean it in the sense that I believed a single word she'd said about why. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the half-finished report on my screen, without seeing it, the numbers blurring into meaningless shapes. Something about that call had the exact texture of every fraud investigation I'd ever run. The reasonable-sounding explanation offered a little too quickly, the emotional language deployed to shut down further questions, the sense that I was being handled rather than talked to. I didn't have proof of anything yet. I want to be clear about that. I had a bad feeling, a professional instinct sharpened by 11 years of catching people lying to protect money, and nothing more concrete than that. But that instinct was loud enough that when I got home that night, instead of letting it go the way 29 years of training told me to, I opened my laptop and pulled up the last statement I had on file for Grandma Eleanor's trust, the one I hadn't checked in nearly 2 years, and I started, very quietly, to look. The last statement I had on file was from 20 months earlier, a routine annual summary the Trust's bank sent to both trustees every spring, the kind of document I'd always skimmed for 2 minutes and filed away without a second thought, because I trusted my mother to run the day-to-day, the way you trust a coworker you've never once caught in a lie. That statement showed a balance of just over $218,000, the rental property in Millbrook valued separately, and a modest but steady pattern of small disbursements over the years. Property taxes, maintenance costs, the occasional distribution split evenly between Paige and me, exactly the way Grandma Eleanor's trust documents specified it should be. I remembered signing off on most of those small ones without complaint, because they were tiny, a few $100s here and there, nothing that raised a flag. I called the Trust's bank the next morning during my lunch break, gave them my co-trustee credentials, and asked for a current statement to be sent to my email. The woman on the phone was pleasant and efficient, and she mentioned, almost as an aside while she pulled up the account, that there had been quite a bit of activity recently, more than usual for this time of year. I asked her to clarify what she meant by recently, and she said there'd been 2 disbursement requests submitted in the past 6 weeks, one already processed and one still pending additional authorization. I asked her, keeping my voice as flat and professional as I could manage, whose signature was on those requests. She told me my mother's signature was on both, which was expected since she was the primary trustee handling routine administration. But she also mentioned, because I asked directly, and because bank employees are required to disclose this when asked by an authorized party, that the pending request, the larger of the two, required a second signature before it could be released, mine, since it exceeded the threshold the trust documents specified for single trustee authorization. She said the request had been submitted 3 weeks earlier and was still showing as awaiting co-trustee approval. I asked her the amount. She told me $42,000. I asked her the stated purpose listed on the request form. She read it back to me in the flat administrative tone bank. Employees use for everything. Family educational and professional development expenses. I sat in my car in the parking garage outside my office, the phone still warm against my ear, doing the math I do for a living, except this time, the equation had my own name in it. $42,000 was more than Grandma Eleanor's trust had ever disbursed at once in the 8 years since she passed. It was, as I would later confirm, almost exactly the amount required to clear Paige's outstanding debt from her failed coaching certification and both credit cards, with enough left over to cover, I assumed, whatever new venture she was planning to launch herself into next. And it required my signature, a signature nobody had asked me for, on a request that had been sitting pending for 3 weeks while my mother called me to ask, gently, kindly, for my own good, to please just skip Christmas this year, so I wouldn't make things uncomfortable for Paige. I understood then, sitting there in that parking garage with the engine off and the December cold seeping in through the windows, exactly what the phone call had actually been. It wasn't about sparing Paige's feelings. It was about buying time. Keep Renee away from the house. Keep the conversation surface level and warm. Keep her occupied with her own quiet acceptance of exile, long enough that maybe, somehow, the pending distribution would just get pushed through. Or maybe they were hoping I'd forget to check. The same way I'd forgotten to check for the last 20 months. The same way I'd trained myself my whole life not to ask too many questions about resources that flowed toward my sister and away from me. I didn't sign anything that week. I didn't call the bank back and demand answers or fire off an angry email to my mother, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to. Instead, I did what 11 years of forensic accounting had taught me to do. When you find the first thread of something that might unravel much further than it appears. I pulled quietly, and I kept my face calm while I did it. I requested full transaction history on the trust going back 3 years instead of the current summary I'd originally asked for. I wanted to see the pattern, not just the anomaly, because in my experience, the anomaly is never actually the beginning of the story. It's just the moment you happen to notice it. That was the week the video call happened, the one on Christmas Eve where I sat frozen on my couch, listening to my own family plan around a signature they had already assumed I'd give, without asking a single question, because that's who Renee is, always fine, never needing anything, never looking too closely at what was hers. Except by the time that call came through, 6 weeks after my mother's careful phrasing about Paige's fragile confidence, I already had the full transaction history sitting in a folder on my laptop, already had a printed timeline on my kitchen table with dates and amounts circled in red pen, already had a very clear sense of exactly what my family had been doing while they were busy deciding, without ever once consulting me, that I was the one who didn't need to be at the table this year. What I hadn't known yet, what I only learned in full from those 11 minutes of unintentionally recorded conversation, was how far they were prepared to go once the polite version stopped working, and how little it had ever actually taken for the people who raised me to decide that my absence was simply more convenient than my presence, so long as the money kept moving in the direction they'd already chosen for it, toward the daughter they'd spent 30 years teaching to need everything, and away from the one they'd spent the same 30 years teaching to need nothing at all. The morning after Christmas Eve, after 11 minutes of listening to my own mother's satisfaction at the idea that I'd never even know what was gone, I did the only thing I know how to do when the ground shifts under me. I went to work. Not to the office. My office was closed for the holiday, but to the version of work I do best, laying evidence out in careful, chronological order until the shape of a lie becomes undeniable, even to the people who told it. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, the full 3-year transaction history from the trust, and a legal pad, and I started building the timeline the same way I've built dozens of them for clients who paid me to find exactly this kind of theft in someone else's family. The pattern, once I had all the data in front of me instead of just the single alarming request, was worse than I'd expected, and somehow also more mundane, which is the thing about real fraud that television never quite captures. It rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates in small, forgivable increments until one day, the total is unforgivable. Over the previous 18 months, there had been 6 disbursements from the trust, each one under the $10,000 threshold that would have required my co-signature, each one timed just far enough apart that no single bank employee reviewing the account would have flagged a pattern. $9,200 for what the paperwork called equipment and certification fees. $8,800 for what it called professional relocation support. Smaller amounts scattered between, always just under the line, always signed by my mother alone, always for Paige, though her name never appeared directly on a single form. Only my mother's. Only ever my mother's. That was the part that made my hands go cold as I worked through it. not the money itself, though the total came to just over $31,000 before the pending $42,000 request even entered the picture. But the precision of it, the deliberate structuring designed to stay under a reporting threshold. In my professional life, I have a specific term for exactly this pattern: structuring, breaking a large transaction into smaller ones, specifically to avoid the oversight that would otherwise catch it. It's a term I use in fraud reports about strangers, about corporate embezzlers and business partners skimming from shared accounts. I had never once, not in my worst imagination, expected to type that word into a document with my own mother's name in the subject line. I called Marcus Delgado the day after Christmas, an estate attorney I'd worked alongside professionally on 2 prior cases and trusted enough to bring my personal life to his desk, which is not something I do easily. He listened without interrupting while I walked him through the trust structure, the co-trustee requirement, the pattern of disbursements, and finally, the pending $42,000 request still sitting unauthorized because it required my signature, a signature nobody had asked me for, because they'd assumed, correctly for most of my life, that I would either never notice or never object. Marcus was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then he said something that has stayed with me since. He said, "Renee, this isn't a family disagreement. What you're describing is a breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on what else we find, potentially something the State Attorney General's office would take a great deal of interest in." We spent the next 2 weeks building the case properly, the way you build something meant to survive contact with people who will lie to your face without hesitation. Marcus helped me draft a formal written request to the Trust's bank for a complete audit trail on every disbursement going back to the Trust's founding, not just the recent history, because he wanted to see whether this pattern had roots even earlier than I'd assumed. I also did something Marcus specifically advised, which was to register the trust account for real-time transaction alerts, a simple safeguard most people don't bother with, but one that meant from that point forward, I would know the instant any request was submitted or processed, no matter how small, no matter how carefully timed to avoid my attention. I found the notary next, or rather, I found the absence of one where there should have been something more. The pending $42,000 request, the one still sitting unauthorized, had been filled out and submitted through the bank's online portal, but attached to it was a letter, purportedly from Paige, explaining the educational purpose of the funds, and that letter had been notarized. I recognized the notary's stamp because I'd seen it before, on documents from a small strip mall office 2 towns from Millbrook that did, among other things, mobile notarization for people who didn't want to leave the comfort of somewhere familiar. I called the office directly, gave them the document number, and asked to confirm the details of the notarization on file. The woman who answered told me, after checking, that their records showed the notarization had been performed at a private residence, not the office, an address that matched my parents' house exactly. I didn't sign the distribution request. I never signed it, not once, not under any pressure, though the pressure did come. 3 separate calls from my mother in the first 2 weeks of January, each one warmer and more urgent than the last, each one carefully avoiding any mention of the specific amount or purpose, just gentle reminders that there was some paperwork I needed to look at when I had a chance. No rush, honey, whenever you get to it. I let every single one of those calls go unanswered until I had everything Marcus said I needed: the full audit trail, the notarization confirmation, a formal written statement from the bank confirming that the pending request remained unauthorized, specifically because the second required signature had never been obtained, and finally, transcribed and time-stamped, the 11 minutes of audio from Christmas Eve, the recording where my own family, in their own voices, explained exactly what they intended to do and exactly how little they expected me to ever find out. By the 3rd week of January, I had a folder Marcus described as airtight, a phrase I'd used myself 100 times about other people's downfall, and I finally understood, sitting in his office with that folder closed on the desk between us, why it always felt less like triumph than people expect, and more like grief, the particular grief of proving, beyond any possible doubt, that the family you spent your whole life trying to be fine for had never once, not for a single Christmas, been planning to be fine for you. Marcus and I talked for a long time about how to handle what came next, because he understood, the way good lawyers do, that having the evidence was only half of the problem, and the other half was deciding what kind of daughter I wanted to be walking out the other side of this. I could have simply refused to sign, quietly, coldly, and let the $42,000 request expire unauthorized, disappearing the way so many of my family's uncomfortable truths had always been allowed to disappear, folded away in a drawer nobody opened again. Part of me, the part still trained by 29 years of being the strong one who didn't need to make a scene, wanted exactly that, a clean, silent exit. But I had spent 6 weeks watching my own family plan around the assumption that I would never look too closely, and something in me had finally, fully run out of patience for being underestimated in my own life. I told my mother I wanted to come to Sunday dinner, the first weekend of February, and that I'd bring dessert. She sounded relieved in a way that made my stomach turn a little, because I understood by then that her relief was never really about missing me. It was about the possibility that whatever awkwardness had been sitting between us since Christmas might finally be smoothed over without anyone having to say a difficult word out loud. She told Paige would be there too, and my father, of course. And wasn't it nice that we could all just move past this? I said it would be nice, and I meant that in the clinical sense a fraud investigator means it. The sense of watching a suspect walk voluntarily into the exact room where the evidence has already been laid out waiting for them. I arrived at my parents' house that Sunday at exactly 5:30, carrying a pie in one hand, and, in my bag, a folder Marcus had prepared, along with a portable speaker small enough to fit in my coat pocket. Paige was already there when I walked in, curled on the living room couch scrolling her phone, and she looked up at me with a smile that had exactly the right amount of sisterly warmth in it. The kind of smile you practice in a mirror when you've decided the hard part of a plan is already behind you. My father hugged me at the door, the same slightly stiff, slightly relieved hug he'd given me my whole life, and my mother fussed over the pie, exclaiming that I shouldn't have, that I always went overboard, the same script we'd been running for years, except this time I could hear underneath every word of it exactly what it had actually been protecting. Dinner itself was almost unbearably ordinary. Roast chicken and my mother's green beans, small talk about the weather, about a neighbor's new fence, about Paige's coaching business which she described, with a straight face, as finally turning a corner. I ate and nodded and asked polite questions in exactly the voice I use across a conference table from someone I already know is lying to me, because that voice, calm and pleasant and slightly too patient, is the most useful tool I own. When my mother finally, gently, brought up the trust paperwork, wondering aloud whether I'd had a chance to look at it yet, no pressure of course, whenever it was convenient, I set down my fork and told her that yes, actually, I had looked at it very closely, and that I thought we should talk about it as a family, right now, all 4 of us at the table. I watched my mother's face do something complicated. A flicker of surprise quickly smoothed over into that same practiced warmth, and I watched my father's shoulders tighten in the specific way they had always tightened whenever a conversation threatened to leave the safe, shallow water he preferred. Paige set her phone down for the first time since I'd walked in, and I could see her doing quick math behind her eyes, trying to determine how much I actually knew. I took the folder out of my bag and set it on the table between the serving dishes, unopened, and I told them, calmly, that I wanted to talk about the 6 disbursements over the past 18 months, each one structured just under the $10,000 threshold that would have required my signature, all of it totaling just over $31,000. None of it ever discussed with me, none of it ever disclosed as required under Grandma Eleanor's trust documents, which explicitly named me as co-trustee for exactly this reason. My mother's face went pale in a way I had genuinely never seen before, and my father set his own fork down slowly, the sound of it against the plate, unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the room. I told them next about the pending $42,000 request, still sitting unauthorized in the bank's system because it needed my signature, a signature nobody had ever actually asked me for, only assumed I'd eventually provide the way I had provided everything else my whole life without complaint. I told them I'd confirmed with the bank that the notarized letter attached to that request had been signed at their address, in their house, weeks before my mother ever called me to explain, so gently, so kindly, why it would be better if I skipped Christmas so I wouldn't make things uncomfortable for Paige. Paige's face crumpled first, not into an apology, but into something closer to panic, and she said, her voice climbing, that I didn't understand, that she was drowning, that this wasn't fair, that I'd never once had to struggle the way she had to struggle. My mother reached across the table and tried to take my hand, her voice trembling, telling me it wasn't what it looked like, that they'd always meant to explain it to me properly, that they knew I'd understand because I was the reasonable one, the strong one, the one who always understood. I didn't take her hand. I sat very still, the way I had sat very still on my couch that Christmas Eve, and I reached into my coat pocket and set the small speaker on the table beside the unopened folder, and I pressed play. The 11 minutes filled the dining room the way water fills a sinking hole, my sister's voice bright with champagne saying once Renee signs off, she'll never even know it's gone. My father's low, careful explanation about the accountant who trusted the family enough to sign whatever was put in front of her. My mother's laugh, that same terrible, satisfied laugh, saying that's the beauty of it, she's not even here to ask questions. I watched all three of their faces while their own voices played back to them across the dinner table, watched the exact moment each of them understood there was no explanation left that could survive what they were hearing, and when the recording finally ended, I said the only thing I'd come there to say, quietly, without raising my voice even once, that I would not be signing the distribution, that Marcus was already prepared to file a formal breach of fiduciary duty complaint if the earlier disbursements weren't returned to the trust in full, and that the next time someone in this family decided I wasn't worth including, they should probably make sure I couldn't hear them deciding it. Nobody spoke for a long moment after the recording ended, the four of us sitting in the wreckage of a roast chicken dinner, with the truth laid out plainly on the table between us, and then my mother started crying. Not the practiced, gentle warmth she'd used on the phone in November, but something raw and frightened, and she said my name over and over, like it might undo what had just been played out loud in her own dining room. My father didn't cry. He just stared at the tablecloth, his jaw working the way it does when he's trying to find words that don't exist yet, and Paige, my little sister, the one who'd needed protecting since the day she was born 6 weeks early, looked at me across the table and said the thing that ended up mattering more than anything else that night. She said, "You were always going to be fine anyway, Renee. That's just who you are," as if my strength had been the crime instead of theirs. I left that house at 8:30, with the pie untouched on the counter, and Marcus's number already in my recent calls, and the following week we filed the formal complaint outlining the structured disbursements and the pending unauthorized request, along with a demand that the $31,000 already withdrawn be repaid to the trust with interest within 60 days, or the matter would move to the State Attorney General's office for further review. I want to be honest that I didn't do this out of some cold desire for revenge, though I understand if that's hard to believe given everything you've just heard. I did it because Grandma Eleanor built that trust specifically to protect the clever girl in the family from exactly this kind of quiet erasure, and letting it happen anyway would have meant letting her be wrong about me. My parents repaid the money over the following 4 months, selling a small piece of land my father had inherited years earlier to cover most of it, and I softened the timeline once Marcus confirmed the repayment plan was real and moving, because I never wanted to bankrupt my own parents, only to make them see me. Paige and I have not spoken since that dinner. Not directly, though I heard through my father, who calls now every few weeks in a way he never used to, that she moved back in with a friend, and finally started actual outpatient credit counseling instead of another certification course. I don't know if she'll ever fully understand what she asked of me that Christmas, or whether she'll ever say it plainly, but I've stopped needing her to. My mother wrote me a letter in the spring, an actual handwritten letter, 4 pages long, and in it she admitted something I don't think she'd ever said out loud to anyone, that she'd spent so many years afraid of losing Paige that she never once stopped to ask what it might cost to keep almost losing me instead. It wasn't a perfect apology. She still framed a lot of it around Paige's fragility, still called me the strong one in a way that made my jaw tighten even as I read it. But it was more honesty than I'd gotten from her in 3 decades, and I've decided, carefully, on my own terms, to let that be a door left slightly open, rather than one closed for good. We talk now, once a week, short calls, careful ones. The kind you have when you're both relearning what honesty is supposed to sound like between two people who spent a lifetime performing something easier instead. I still keep the folder Marcus prepared, the audit trail, the notarization confirmation, the transcript of those 11 minutes, filed away in a drawer I never open anymore, because I don't need to look at it to remember what it taught me. What it taught me is that being called the strong one was never actually a compliment. It was a category, a place my family put me so they wouldn't have to think too hard about what I might need, and that the moment I stopped accepting that category quietly was the exact moment they finally had to see me as a person instead of a convenience. Grandma Eleanor knew that 30 years ago when she looked at a family that had already decided one granddaughter was fragile and the other was fine, and she quietly wrote her clever girl into the one document nobody thought to question, because she understood, better than any of us did at the time, that being needed by no one is not the same thing as being loved by everyone, and that sometimes the people who tell you not to worry about them are the ones who most deserve to be worried about. If there's one thing I want you to take from everything I've shared tonight, it's this. If you have spent your whole life being the strong one, the reliable one, the one nobody checks on because you always seem fine, that title is not a compliment, and it is not a fixed truth about who you are. It is often just the story a family tells itself, so they can feel less guilty about where the attention and the resources actually flow. You are allowed to ask questions about what's yours. You are allowed to notice the pattern, even when noticing it feels like betrayal, even when the people asking you to look away are the ones who raised you. I spent 29 years being fine so that everyone else around me could afford not to be, and it took one overheard phone call on the loneliest Christmas Eve of my life to finally understand that fine was never the compliment I thought it was just the excuse they used to leave me out of the room.